when I found a letter from the HOA on my doorstep. The envelope was sealed with their usual bold, official notice stamp, and I immediately felt a sense of dread wash over me. I'd already had my share of run-ins with the HOA over the years, but this time felt different. I opened the letter, and sure enough, it was another complaint. The HOA was claiming that my electric vehicle EV charging station, which I had recently installed in my driveway, violated the neighborhood's rules. According to them, it was unsightly and could disrupt the uniformity of the community. They demanded that I remove the station immediately or face a fine. I stared at the letter, trying to process what I had just read. The charging station was mounted on the side of my garage, neatly tucked away in an inconspicuous corner. It wasn't large, and it didn't disrupt the flow of my property in any way. It was installed professionally and was barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The fact that the HOA considered it an eyesore was laughable. I had installed the charging station for a very simple reason: to reduce my carbon footprint. I had recently purchased an electric vehicle, a decision I was proud of as it aligned with my personal commitment to sustainability. I knew that electric vehicles were the future of transportation, and providing the necessary infrastructure to charge them at home was part of that future. This wasn't just a personal convenience. It was a step toward contributing to the larger effort of reducing emissions and fostering clean energy. But now it felt like the HOA wanted to punish me for making an environmentally conscious decision. I wasn't just annoyed, I was angry. As a clean energy lawyer, I knew my rights. I had read about laws protecting homeowners' rights to install EV charging stations, and I was well versed in the protections provided by state and federal clean energy legislation. I also knew that HOA boards couldn't simply impose arbitrary restrictions on such installations without a solid legal basis. As I sat there reading the letter, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to let the HOA dictate my ability to use clean energy in my own home. This was my property, and I had every right to install a charging station for my electric vehicle. It was time to fight back. I wasn't going to let this slip by without a fight. As a clean energy lawyer, I knew the importance of legal protections when it came to sustainable energy practices, especially for something as vital as electric vehicle infrastructure. The right to install an EV charging station in a residential area was not just a personal choice. It was becoming a necessary step for homeowners who were looking to embrace clean energy and contribute to reducing the carbon footprint. First, I got to work researching the legalities of the situation. I started by reviewing local zoning laws and state regulations that pertain to electric vehicles and charging stations. I knew that many states had passed laws explicitly supporting the installation of EV chargers at residential properties, with clear restrictions on HOAs preventing their installation without solid justification. Sure enough, I found that my state had specific protections for homeowners who wanted to install EV charging equipment, making it illegal for an HOA to block such an installation without a legitimate reason. These laws were part of the larger push toward sustainability, designed to facilitate the transition to electric vehicles by making charging infrastructure more accessible. Armed with this knowledge, I also took a look at the HOA's governing documents, specifically the architectural and aesthetic guidelines. These guidelines covered things like paint colors, landscaping, and the types of structures homeowners could add to their properties. I knew these rules were typically vague, and this time, they seemed to be grasping at straws. Nowhere in the document did it specifically mention electric vehicle charging stations. The HOA had a general clause about maintaining uniformity and avoiding unsightly additions, but there was no clear rule regarding EV chargers, let alone any mention of them being prohibited. I pulled out my laptop and began drafting a response to the HOA. I wasn't going to just accept their arbitrary demands. My letter needed to be firm but respectful, and more importantly, it had to make it clear that I knew my rights and was prepared to defend them. I carefully outlined the legal protections for EV owners, referencing both state and federal laws that supported the right to install EV chargers at residential properties. I made sure to explain the growing importance of sustainable energy solutions, especially in neighborhoods where residents were increasingly adopting electric vehicles. I also addressed the HOA's aesthetic concerns, pointing out that my charging station was professionally installed, neatly tucked in a discreet location, and didn't interfere with the overall visual appeal of the neighborhood. I offered to meet with the HOA board to discuss how I could work with them to ensure the charger was integrated in a way that didn't disrupt the neighborhood's look, even offering to provide examples of other properties with similar setups that had been well received. I concluded the letter by stating that if the HOA continued to pursue the fine or force the removal of the charger, I would be forced to take legal action. I made it clear that I wasn't going to back down from my right to embrace clean energy and that I would seek damages for any undue stress or harm to my reputation caused by their refusal to acknowledge my rights. Once the letter was ready, I gave it one last review. I felt a sense of confidence. This was my right as a homeowner, and I wasn't going to let anyone, especially the HOA, tell me that I couldn't do my part in the fight against climate change. I sealed the envelope, and off it went to the HOA board. Days passed after I sent the letter, and the waiting game began. The anticipation was nerve-wracking, especially as I continued to see my neighbors' electric vehicles parked in their driveways, often parked next to their charging stations. I couldn't help but feel the irony. The HOA's stance on my charger felt increasingly out of touch with the reality that many residents in the community were driving electric vehicles and would eventually need chargers at home. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I received a response from the HOA. I tore open the envelope, already steeling myself for what I might find inside. As I read the letter, I could feel my frustration building. The HOA's response was dismissive. They didn't address any of the legal points I had raised regarding the state laws that protected my right to install the charging station. Instead, they stuck to their original argument that the charger was unsightly and detracted from the uniformity of the neighborhood. The letter repeated their demand that I remove the charging station or face further fines, even after I had presented evidence that this request was both legally questionable and unreasonable. They maintained that they could enforce their aesthetic standards, despite the fact that those standards had never once mentioned electric vehicle infrastructure. I was livid. It was clear that the HOA had no intention of backing down, despite the facts and the law on my side. They were more focused on maintaining an outdated ideal of uniformity than they were on embracing the future. I knew this wasn't just about a charging station anymore. It was about the HOA's refusal to acknowledge the inevitable shift toward clean energy. They were trying to impose rules that stifled progress, and I couldn't let that stand. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I had the law on my side, and I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. I consulted with some colleagues in environmental law and clean energy advocacy to get their input. They reinforced that my case was solid, that under state and federal law, the HOA was overstepping its bounds. One of them even suggested I look into filing a formal complaint with a local housing authority if the HOA didn't back off. At this point, I knew it was time to escalate. The next step was clear. I would take legal action. I immediately began preparing for the next phase of the fight. I made contact with a local law firm specializing in property rights and environmental law. I explained the situation to them, and they agreed to take on my case. Together, we would craft a lawsuit that would challenge the HOA's illegal interference with my right to install an EV charging station. I was ready to take the fight to court if necessary. I wasn't just defending my right to charge my electric vehicle at home. I was standing up for the right of homeowners everywhere to adopt clean energy solutions without being bullied by outdated HOA rules. The HOA had made their move, and now it was my turn. I was determined to follow through with my decision. I wasn't just fighting for my own right to install an electric vehicle charging station. I was fighting for all homeowners who wanted to embrace sustainable energy practices without fear of discrimination or unreasonable restrictions from their HOA. After consulting with a law firm, we began preparing the paperwork for the lawsuit. I knew it wouldn't be a quick process, but I was ready for a long fight if necessary. As I prepared for court, I started gathering more evidence to strengthen my case. I began reaching out to neighbors and local residents who had either installed EV chargers or were planning to in the near future. Some of them had been hesitant to speak out, fearing retaliation from the HOA, but after hearing about my legal plans, several of them came forward and offered statements about how they, too, had felt intimidated by the HOA's stance on sustainability. I was able to collect testimonials from residents who had electric vehicles, but no way to charge them at home. Some had to rely on public charging stations, which were often inconvenient or overcrowded. Others shared how they had been discouraged from pursuing clean energy options due to the HOA's resistance to change. These personal stories were powerful. They showed just how much the HOA's policies were hindering the growth of clean transportation in the neighborhood. I also worked with my lawyer to draft a formal complaint to the local housing authority, as one of the legal experts had recommended. The complaint detailed how the HOA's actions were in direct violation of state and federal laws protecting homeowners' rights to install EV charging stations. I made sure to include the fact that the HOA's aesthetic guidelines were vague and did not specifically address the issue of electric vehicle infrastructure. This was important because the HOA could not enforce rules that were not clearly outlined in their governing documents, especially when they were in conflict with legal protections for green energy solutions. As the case started to take shape, I was approached by a few local media outlets who had caught wind of the situation. They wanted to cover the story of a homeowner taking on the HOA to defend their right to sustainable living. I agreed, knowing this would help spread the message about the importance of clean energy and the challenges homeowners faced when trying to implement environmentally friendly solutions. The media attention was a double-edged sword. While it certainly put pressure on the HOA, it also led to some negative attention from certain residents who supported the HOA's stance on neighborhood uniformity. I had some heated conversations with people who accused me of making a scene or overreacting, arguing that the HOA was simply trying to preserve the appearance of the neighborhood. But I stood firm, explaining that the fight was not just about my charger. It was about future-proofing our community for the next generation of homeowners and ensuring that we weren't left behind as the world moved toward cleaner, more sustainable energy. Eventually, the HOA board agreed to a mediation session, likely pressured by the growing media attention and legal challenges. The meeting was tense. The HOA board president, a woman who had been particularly vocal about banning the charger, sat across from me, clearly frustrated. But I remained calm, knowing that I had done my homework and was well prepared for whatever they threw at me. The mediator, a neutral third party, was experienced in HOA disputes and helped keep the session on track. We spent hours going back and forth, with the HOA trying to argue their point that the charger was a disruption to neighborhood aesthetics. I countered by explaining that clean energy infrastructure was the future, and this particular installation was minimal and in no way disruptive. My lawyer presented legal evidence showing how other communities had successfully integrated EV charging stations and how these stations had even increased property values by making homes more attractive to environmentally conscious buyers. In the end, the HOA board made an offer. They would allow me to keep the charging station if I agreed to relocate it to a less visible spot in my driveway, something that would still allow me to charge my vehicle, but might not be as immediately noticeable. In return, they would drop the fine, and I could continue using the station without further legal threats. I wasn't entirely satisfied, but it was a fair compromise. I agreed to relocate the charging station, knowing that it wasn't about the location of the charger anymore. It was about the principle of the matter. The HOA had been forced to acknowledge the importance of clean energy, and the precedent was set for other homeowners who might face similar battles in the future. After the mediation, I felt a mix of relief and frustration. The compromise had allowed me to keep the EV charging station, though it had to be relocated to a less visible part of my driveway. On the surface, it seemed like a small win, but deep down, I knew the bigger battle was still far from over. The HOA had essentially been forced into compliance by the legal pressure, but I knew that this issue wasn't just about one charging station. It was about the broader fight to create space for sustainable living within communities that had long been resistant to change. In the weeks that followed, I took a step back to reflect on everything that had happened. I was proud of what I had accomplished. I had defended my right to green energy and, in doing so, helped pave the way for other homeowners who might face similar challenges. But I knew that this fight wasn't just mine to win. I had to keep pushing forward for a long-term solution that would protect everyone in the neighborhood, not just a single property. I began reaching out to neighbors who had shown interest in electric vehicles, but had been hesitant to install their own chargers due to the HOA's opposition. I wanted to reassure them that they didn't have to live in fear of retaliation from the HOA, and that sustainable energy solutions should be embraced, not stifled. Over time, I began organizing a series of community discussions, where residents could share their experiences with renewable energy and learn about the benefits of transitioning to electric vehicles and green technology. The HOA, though initially resistant, began to take notice of these efforts. Residents started talking more openly about their interest in solar panels, energy-efficient home improvements, and electric vehicles. There was a growing sense of community-wide support for embracing sustainable living practices, and the HOA was starting to feel the pressure to keep up with the times. One evening, I received an unexpected phone call from the HOA president, the same one who had fought against my charger from the beginning. She told me that the board had been discussing the long-term implications of their current policies, particularly in light of the changes I had initiated within the neighborhood. She admitted that they had been short-sighted in their initial opposition to my electric vehicle charger, and that they were now considering updating their community guidelines to include provisions that would allow for the installation of EV chargers, solar panels, and other eco-friendly infrastructure. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. The same person who had been so adamantly against my charger was now acknowledging that the neighborhood needed to evolve. She went on to say that the board would be meeting soon to discuss how to update their guidelines to be more in line with modern sustainability practices, and that they were considering offering incentives for homeowners who installed green technology. That conversation marked a turning point for me. It wasn't just about winning this one fight anymore. It was about ensuring that the neighborhood as a whole was making strides toward embracing clean energy and green practices. I agreed to meet with the HOA to offer input on their proposed changes to the guidelines. This was an opportunity to ensure that the HOA's new stance was genuine and would truly benefit everyone in the community. I was no longer just a homeowner defending my rights. I had become an advocate for sustainable change. At the next HOA meeting, I presented ideas for the updated guidelines, including clear provisions for the installation of EV chargers, solar panels, and energy-efficient landscaping. I also suggested setting up a program where homeowners could receive resources, tax credits, and information on how to integrate green technologies into their homes. The board was surprisingly receptive, and we discussed practical ways to implement these ideas without disrupting the neighborhood's aesthetic or raising concerns from residents. The meeting with the HOA was a breakthrough. The board agreed to take the next steps in revising the community guidelines, with many of the ideas I had proposed being incorporated into their plans. We had reached a consensus that would allow for electric vehicle chargers, solar panels, and other sustainable infrastructure, but more importantly, we had started a larger conversation about how the neighborhood could evolve in line with modern environmental goals. The HOA board members were excited about the prospect of becoming a community leader in sustainability, but they also expressed concerns about how to manage the integration of these technologies in a way that maintained the neighborhood's overall look. This was where my role became more crucial than ever. As an advocate for clean energy, I knew that this shift had to be carefully planned and communicated to residents. The key would be making these sustainable solutions available to everyone, while also addressing the aesthetic concerns some residents had. To keep the momentum going, I offered to organize a series of informational workshops for the neighborhood. These workshops would cover the benefits of electric vehicles, solar energy, and other green technologies, as well as how homeowners could implement these changes while maintaining the visual integrity of their homes. I worked with local experts in clean energy and sustainability to ensure that the workshops were both educational and practical. As the workshops began, I noticed a shift in the attitude of the community. At first, many residents were hesitant about the changes, worried about the potential costs or how it might affect their property values. But after attending the workshops, many of them realized that clean energy solutions were not only affordable, but they could also enhance their home's value in the long run. The idea that sustainability could coexist with aesthetic standards began to take root. More and more neighbors started to express interest in installing their own electric vehicle chargers, adding solar panels, or creating organic gardens. Some residents even began approaching the HOA, asking how they could get involved in the new sustainability initiatives. The conversation had gone from one person challenging the system to an entire neighborhood embracing change. As the months went by, the HOA finally unveiled their new set of guidelines. These updates were designed to support homeowners who wanted to install electric vehicle chargers, solar panels, and rainwater harvesting systems. The new rules included specific provisions for maintaining the visual appearance of these technologies, ensuring that they could be installed in ways that blended seamlessly with the neighborhood's aesthetic. There were also incentives for homeowners who adopted clean energy solutions, including tax breaks, community recognition, and priority for solar-powered streetlights in certain areas. The announcement was a major win, not just for me, but for the entire community. The neighborhood had transformed from a place where environmental innovation was seen as an afterthought to one where sustainability was actively embraced. I felt a deep sense of pride in knowing that I had played a part in helping the community evolve into a greener, more forward-thinking place. But the most rewarding moment came when I received a letter from the HOA president. She thanked me for my efforts and acknowledged that, without my persistence and dedication, the neighborhood would not have taken such a bold step towards sustainability. She also mentioned that the HOA had received several inquiries from other communities about how they had successfully integrated clean energy initiatives and updated their rules. It was clear that our neighborhood had become a model for others to follow. Looking back, it had all started with one small, personal decision to install an electric vehicle charging station in my driveway. But what that decision sparked was something much larger, a movement within the community to embrace the future of clean energy. It had been a battle, but it was also a journey of learning, growth, and connection. And now the neighborhood was better for it. The success of the new guidelines and the community's shift towards sustainability didn't just mark a personal victory. It also opened doors for new opportunities. With the HOA's formal endorsement of green energy practices, I started to get more involved in advocating for clean energy solutions beyond just my neighborhood. Local environmental groups reached out, asking me to speak at events, and I began collaborating with other homeowners associations to help them navigate the challenges of integrating sustainable practices. One of the most rewarding projects was when a neighboring community asked me to assist them in creating their own green guidelines, inspired by the success we had in our neighborhood. They had been facing similar resistance from their HOA boards about the installation of EV chargers and solar panels. I traveled to their meetings, shared our story, and helped them draft policies that would allow for cleaner, more energy-efficient living. The media also continued to cover our neighborhood's transformation, and I began to see the ripple effect of our efforts in neighboring towns and even in cities a few miles away. People were taking note of what had been accomplished, and many were looking to replicate it. I was interviewed for local news outlets, and even featured in a few environmental publications. I had become somewhat of a local champion for green energy and sustainable living, which was a humbling experience. But with this newfound attention came new challenges. As more residents in surrounding areas began pushing for similar changes, I knew that the legal landscape around HOA governance and sustainable living would continue to evolve. I started receiving more calls from homeowners facing resistance to their EV chargers or solar panels, and I began consulting with other lawyers in the clean energy space to understand how we could collectively address these growing issues. As part of this broader initiative, I launched a series of workshops aimed at educating HOA boards across the region about the benefits of sustainable practices and how to navigate legal challenges related to clean energy infrastructure. These sessions became a forum where I could share my experiences, discuss legal rights, and offer solutions that could help communities integrate green technologies without unnecessary obstacles. But even with all the progress, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me here. The battle with the HOA had started as something personal, a small, seemingly insignificant decision to install an EV charging station. However, it had snowballed into something much larger, something that had touched every corner of my neighborhood and beyond. The once controversial idea of green infrastructure was now becoming a mainstream expectation. And then came the moment I least expected. The HOA, after months of implementing new sustainability measures, invited me to sit on a newly formed Green Advisory Committee. The board president called me personally to offer the position, saying that my leadership and expertise had been invaluable in shaping the future of the neighborhood. I was both honored and overwhelmed. It was a recognition of how far we had come, how much my individual action had triggered a collective shift. This committee would be tasked with ensuring that the neighborhood continued to adopt sustainable practices while also balancing aesthetic concerns. It would be a place where new green energy ideas could be explored, tested, and integrated into the community. I couldn't believe how far I had come, from being the homeowner with a simple request to defend my charging station to now helping steer the neighborhood's entire future toward clean energy. I accepted the position, knowing that it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a long-term commitment to ensuring that clean energy solutions would be available and accessible for generations to come.